Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in today's video we're going to talk about how Christianity is the reason for the abolishing of slavery around the world today. It's Christianity that got rid of slavery. Specifically, the idea that, hey, we shouldn't enslave people because people have a right to basic freedom and to not be enslaved it is a Christian innovation. It is a production of Christianity. It is produced by Christianity. And you may want to argue with me and say, Ben, that's not true. This is one of those topics that is like easy to kind of defend, and it's clearly true. And so it kind of is upsetting for a lot of people's sort of sacred beliefs. So I'm just going to put that out there. There's a lot of people who really don't like this reality. And part of the problem is the fact that the British Empire is largely to blame for getting rid of slavery in a lot of countries around the world. So a lot of places around the world eventually in the long run got rid of slavery because Britain controlled the high seas, and so they just, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Britain went around and said, we're not going to let you do trade, and we're going to economically put pressure on you until you get rid of slavery. And so a lot of places like China, gets rid of slavery in I think 1910, that sort of thing. So that happened, and a lot of people don't like to admit this is one of those things that's true, and once you find it out, it's so incredible that you realize yeah, that's going to make a lot of people really angry. And it's one of those things. You get a lot of failure to admit it, and I'm going to be able to prove this, and you're going to be able to look up and find out that I'm right, and it's going to be it's one of those points that I feel uncomfortable making, because it's so obviously this is one of those where anyone who disagrees with me is not going to be just a little bit wrong. They're just so wrong. You know what I mean? It's just sad, and so anyway, let's just dive right in. First of all, let's talk about the origins of slavery. Well, slavery does not originate on this planet until the development of civilization. And when I say civilization, I mean people able to live in large groups, staying in one place, basically able to live in cities, where they're in huge groups of people living in one big, huge city, and everybody doesn't know everybody else in the city. And for that to exist, a lot of things have to happen, have to be in place, or are needed for that to happen. You're going to have some sort of legal system, and one of the main things you're going to need is food. And farming is the key innovation that allows cities to exist. And so slavery is kind of created as soon as farming exists. And the reason is because farming is such a better way of getting food. So if you go back before farming, well, how do you get food? Well, it's real simple. You go out and you just look for food. You find an animal and you take it back, and you kill it and take it back and cook it and eat it. You find fruits and berries and vegetables just growing wild somewhere, and maybe you can eat them raw, or maybe you got to cook them. Voila. Okay, well, in that period, if I was to try to enslave a person, if you were to try to enslave a person, you would run into the problem that the slave can't go out and hunt down enough food for you and the slave. So that you would basically just be taking all the food for yourself, and the slave would just die. So that's why slavery can't exist without farming. Farming creates the ability for there to be a person who can feed herself or himself and also feed you, the owner, and in fact have surplus for you. You know, in many cases, the owner of the person will take more than is left for the slave. So in the ancient world, like in Stone Age time before civilization, I mean, you're going to have murder. People are going to kill someone, or they're going to steal from somebody, or they're going to kill somebody and take all their stuff. But you can't really have slavery. So I mean, the motivation for slavery is essentially like just theft. It's a form of stealing from someone on a continual basis, and then like forcing them to do the work to provide stuff and then for you, and then taking it from them. So it's like perpetuated stealing that's like maintained long term, that's forced on the other person. I mean, if I kill you, or if I steal from you, I'm forcing that on you. But if I like maintain that situation, then essentially I've enslaved you. So especially if I'm not allowing you to go where you want or do what you want. So farming is the key for there to be such a thing as like government and slavery in a sense. So slavery doesn't really have like a unique origin, because murder and stealing don't really have a unique origin. Murder and stealing are just everywhere because people are bad and they do bad stuff, and then like slavery just exists too. So anyway, eventually when these civilizations begin to exist, a simple concept emerges of like, okay, there's strength in numbers. A bunch of people can kill a smaller group of people and then take all their stuff, enslave them, kill some of them, enslave the others, oppress them, rule them, whatever. And you begin to have armies and governments and kings. And then if you're a common person, the king is also like your security net from being invaded from whoever else outside. And so for the stability of living under the king, then you will like submit to the king's oppression yourself. And so these civilizations basically emerge, I think around 3000 BC, or might go back to like 4000. Eventually they get bigger and bigger and stronger. By around 2000 BC, you've got, empires have risen and fallen and things have changed. And in the ancient Near East, which is basically like, the Middle East and Greece and, the Eastern Mediterranean and that sort of thing, you've got 4 big empires. But like, so it's Egypt, whatever is going on in Mesopotamia at the time, and the Hittite Empire in Turkey, and you've got an ancient Greek empire. And the thing is, ancient empires of this period it's the late Bronze Age. By this point, in pretty much all of these ancient empires, even in later periods, even over in India, even when India goes through like sort of their glory days, these are incredibly oppressive empires. So like a small group of elites is essentially wielding an astonishing amount of power. And it's real simple. It's like you might as well team up under the king, because there's strength in numbers. If the king next door can get everyone to team up under him, no one can mess with them. So like these people are ruling like massive, massive, massive poor, really, really poor empires. They're very rich because their empire is so massive, but overall, these are incredibly economically poor empires. Part of the issue has to do with some of these numbers. There's just these empires that, my point is like, they were in the ancient world. This is a command economy where like the government, runs everything because he's got the army, and then you just do whatever the government guy says, the king or the nobles or whoever, and they just, if they don't have you in actual slavery, then it's a very oppressive thing at the very least. So let's just go. In ancient Mesopotamia, whatever kingdoms or empires were there at that time, whenever the ruling elites were incredibly oppressive. Like, for one thing, when the king would die, he would, like, his wife and everyone who worked for him would, like, be killed and, like, buried with him. It was insane, right? But anyway, the ruling elites would take 10% as just a rule, as a standard rule of the crop. Okay? But oftentimes it would be bumped up to 50%. That was not uncommon for them to take 50%. All right, in Egypt, the standard rule was they would take 20%. I think I've given some different numbers in other places, so I had to go back and double check to get these numbers right. But in Egypt, they would take 20%. And then they would do these massive, like, public projects of building projects in Egypt, and you would be like, when it was time for the building project, they would come to the poor people and just make them build the project, you know, like basically short-term slavery. In India, the standard rule was the government would take 25% of the crop. Okay? But in times of emergency, they would take 33%. Okay? And then they would have sometimes the local, like, guy who's, like, collecting the taxes, he would take more. Okay? Even in the ancient Maurya Empire, which we'll talk about when we get to India, where it was a time of economic boom for ancient India, and this is like around, 300, 200 BC-ish, the people lived on almost nothing. Like, they just ate the same rice every day, So people, essentially, most people lived, like, on the cusp of total starvation, like, throughout the ancient world under these command economies. So this is just the way everywhere was, unless you just didn't have a government, and then you were just disorganized, and it was just people running around on their own. Who knows who might kill you, or someone could, if an army decides to come through, you're just done like dinner, And keep in mind that 50% of the overall crop has to be saved to plant next year, generally speaking. I mean, their agricultural abilities, they're not going to save, like, 1% of the crop and then it's going to be so fruitful and they're going to get, 100%, back. Like, no. 50% of the crop has to be saved for planting next year, except when it came to grain crops, they only had to save 33%. So, but you can look at those numbers and it's like, okay, 50%, 30%, you're like, all right, the government's taking, 10, 20, 25, in terrible situations, 33, 50. Like, there's very little left for the vast swath of the population to actually live on, is living on, possibly something similar to what the ruling elite gets for themselves, okay? So free people were pretty close to slaves in terms of money. But slavery is, in a worse sense, like, actually forcing people to do stuff. And of course, the great monuments of these ancient empires that are so incredible are monuments to slavery, because often many people died to build them, and it was, they would force these vast swaths of peasants to build them. So, for example, I think there was a major canal in China that 2 million, died just for building it. That's just who died, And the Great Wall, I think 1 million died to build that. And the problem is, one of the key issues is, like, these ancient empires are not going to be as productive as they could have been, because why work hard and bust your tail to produce more if the the ruling elite is just going to come take everything, right? And I think we all can get that concept. And here's but the question we wonder is, like, well, could they have been more productive? So there's a example to demonstrate this that Rodney Stark, he's a sociologist at Baylor University, gives in a lot of his books. I'm having trouble finding, where, like, he's talking about. So I'll just give you what I got from his book. Specifically, How the West Won is one of the books where he talks about this. But essentially, in the 900s and in the 800s, China underwent basically an industrial revolution was beginning there. You had, and it was based on they were just making a lot of stuff out of iron. And they were doing so much iron production, and iron production was becoming such a huge business that like they weren't just making iron military weapons and arrowheads and spear tips and that sort of thing. They were actually making everyday farm implements. And because of this, iron tools allowed them, they were just way better than, a weak bronze or wooden plow or something like that. They were able to farm much more land and have a huge food increase. And this was not a government-run enterprise. This was a privately, people were privately getting into this iron business, and it was causing this huge population increase. And in fact, it's the birth of the world's first restaurant culture, in the Song Dynasty period. But as quickly as this Industrial Revolution began, it stopped. So in the 11th century, I think this has to do with a bunch of legal reforms that come towards the end of, like 1078 to 1120, 1150 or something like that. It was stopped. And it went from, basically they were producing as much iron. So I think some of the estimates are like as much as England was producing in the 1700s. And then it just dropped to like basically nothing. And what Stark says in his book is the court mandarins, the nobility, noticed that some peasants were getting rich off of this iron business, and then they were hiring other peasants at high wages. And this was deemed to be a threat to their Confucian values, which was like kind of their moral philosophy based on larger religious beliefs. And it was a threat to Confucian values and social tranquility. So essentially the idea is like, you can't have everybody rich because then you'll have anarchy and you won't have stability in the nation, and then there'll be a breakdown of all stability. So the idea is commoners must know their place. Only the elite should be wealthy. So the state monopoly on iron was declared, and they seized all property. And then that put a stop to all productivity, because now the government is just taxing it massively. I think the government, argument was that like this was for the moral benefit of the Chinese, and they wanted to increase the revenue streams coming into the government coffers. So anyway, that gives you an idea of the general background. What we're going to do now is take a look at some case examples. So why don't we just jump into China? But we're going to look at essentially everywhere on the world, not everywhere, but just a big cross-section of the world, and just get a picture of like, okay, slavery, what was the story on slavery in this place, and this place, and this place, just to get a sense of like what happened, And then we're going to take a look at specifically, finally, what Christianity did to end slavery. So in China, slavery in China, we're fairly certain that going back to the Bronze Age, which is around 2000 BC, back to like I think 3 or something, 5% of the overall population is enslaved. Okay, and China is noteworthy because the first ever time that a government like actually abolished slavery, it actually occurs in China. And sometimes this is where it's kind of some of the like the nonsense comes in. People will tell you that slavery was first abolished in China. That was the first time anyone abolished slavery. And it's like, and then they're talking about, in some cases they're talking about the Emperor Wang Mang. Okay, the only emperor of the Wang dynasty, and he was emperor contemporary of Julius Caesar and Jesus, 46 BC to 32 AD. He abolished slavery. He did abolish slavery. But that's only half the truth. What Wang Mang did is he abolished all private property, period. And every family didn't own land, they didn't own slaves, they didn't own anything. Everything is now divided where everybody has like this tiny little patch of land, what he decided was right per family, and then you can guess how he taxed them due to that. So no one has any wealth or power in the nation except Wang Mang. He was very unpopular. I think they came in there and killed him. So I wouldn't call him an abolitionist, but he did abolish slavery. He abolished property itself. This led to full-on war in the nation. I think the estimates are that 25 million people died in the massive war. In the 200s AD, apparently there was a heavy importation into China of slaves from Vietnam. All right. Slavery was expanded in China in the 1200s, and then it was finally abolished in 1910 due to the British Empire putting trade pressure on everyone, economic pressure on people. And there is this other story you might hear about China. There's a story you might read online or see in a video, or someone might tell you that, like, actually the first emperor of China, way back in, like 200 BC or so, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, he was the world's first abolitionist, and that story is a fake story, and we know it's a fake story because there's no record of anyone ever saying that until the 1970s, and it's coming out of the mouth of the incredibly oppressive Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong. So it's a fake story. I mean, it doesn't make sense that no one would have said that before then. All right. If anyone tells you that, ask them, where they get that, and can they show you a source, a historical source for that information before the 1970s? Okay. Let's take a look. Let's keep it in the Far East, and we'll take a look at Japan. Japan has an interesting story, so I thought we'd include Japan. We know that slavery is like an official legal system in Japan as far back as 200 BC. But when the Portuguese opened up sailing around, the Cape of Good Hope and basically control of the Indian Ocean, as far as navigation of the ocean in the 1500s, the Portuguese did this. They opened up an ongoing slave trade at that period in time with Japan. Now, let me point out that the Catholic Church, said, no, you can't do that. And the Catholic Church, the Pope even said that this would be like a block to evangelism itself. And this was a very, very massive slave trade that the Portuguese were managing out of Japan. It was so massive. Remember, the African slave trade is going on at this time with the Portuguese too. But, of course, the African slave trade is older, and the Muslims had been managing it for centuries before that. But anyway, at this point, Portuguese. My point is the Japanese slave trade is so massive that oftentimes the Portuguese would sell Japanese slaves to African slaves. There was just so much of it. So there was like a mass exportation of Japanese people just from Japan. Okay. And the government of Japan becomes outraged about this and demands the return of all Japanese to Japan. They demand an end of the selling of slaves, and they demand an end to all Christian missionary efforts in Japan. In 1590, Japan bans all slavery, but it's another one of those, like, they didn't really. And no one really tries to claim that Japan banned slavery. People try to claim it about China, probably because, I hate to say it, but there's sort of a Marxist thing, and China's, Marxist, and sometimes there's a little bit of rewriting of history. We know that goes on, or attempt to rewrite it, but nobody ever says it about Japan. Partly because, Japan's got a lot of blood on their hands when it comes to slavery. But they did ban slavery in 1590, but at the same time, when they did that, they were engaging in massive wars with the Koreans and were importing massive amounts of slaves from Korea. So it was this hypocritical ban on slavery. It seems like they just didn't want Japanese to be shipped out of Japan. And the Japanese who sold other Japanese to the Portuguese, the Japanese slave traders, were never punished, never even mentioned, and it seems that the slavery of Japanese kind of continued, but the whole thing was to keep them from being exported out of Japan. And I think eventually Japan made it a rule, no white people allowed, no gaijin allowed in Japan. It got worse in Japan during World War II. The Japanese enslaved 10 million Chinese people alone, and then there's like hundreds and hundreds of thousands from other countries. So how did Japan end slavery? Well, they lost World War II, and we made them end slavery. Well, not me personally, but the Allied powers. Okay. Let's talk about the Muslim world. Islam is interesting. So in the Muslim world, you have the founder Prophet Muhammad, and the thing to do to be the best Muslim you can be is to be as much like Muhammad as possible. And the issue is that, like, it's not really controversial. It's one of the well-known, well-documented, and it's a consensus view of the Muslim world and historians in general that Muhammad did himself own slaves. So it's impossible under Islamic religious, theology or doctrine to, like, condemn slavery as a practice in itself. Muhammad did, like, refine slavery to make it not so bad, but the practice itself of enslaving someone is never in doubt, never in question. So it's just not going to happen. One of the things is, like, under Islam, I think, if I remember right, more slaves were shipped out of Africa to the Muslim world than were shipped, to, say, North America. But the issue is that in North America, the slave costs 30 times more than he or she did in Africa. So, like, if the slave costs $30 in Africa, then it's going to cost $900 in North America. So in North America, things were quite different. Like, they didn't, you didn't want the slave to die. And also they instituted chattel slavery, where it was like, okay, if you're the child of a slave, then you're a slave, whereas in the Muslim world, things were a lot better. In a sense, I mean, in some ways they were worse. So what they did was, like, okay, you had to be a prisoner of war that was a properly declared war, or you had to be the child of both a mother and father slave to be a slave. So it's like, well, they had chattel slavery too. Not exactly, because generally what they would do is any male slave would be castrated, and then any female slave would generally be a sex slave to their master, which is not good. It's essentially like rape. It depends, I don't know, case by case basis, but it's pretty close. But anyway, the key for the child is, like, well, that child will, like, it's a system that keeps you from having generations of slaves. And so that's why you don't have this huge population in the Middle East of, like, former slaves, because they always made sure, you were captured in war, you were brought in, you're a slave, but not, everyone else. And the justification for war, I mean, it kind of differed in different places at different times, but they would, basically the idea is, like, you are living under a non-Muslim government, then it would be better for you to be a slave to a Muslim, because non-Muslims are bad people. Okay, and one of the regular things they did in the Middle Ages that really made Christians mad is they would capture Christian boys as slaves and then train them their entire lives to hate and want to kill Christians. And they were called Mamelukes, and probably castrated. So, like, you capture a Christian boy, castrate him, and make him a Mameluke. And so this guy would grow up to be, a Muslim slave who just would, white slaves were incredibly valuable in the Middle Ages. That's the saying was they were like gold when trading with Muslims. Of course, slavery gets abolished throughout the Muslim world, again through Western pressure. Yeah, we've got England to thank for this again. Okay, so here's some dates for you, just of 3 countries here. Afghanistan abolished slavery in 1923. Turkey and Iraq abolished slavery in 1924. And then in 1962, Saudi Arabia abolished slavery. Although it kind of like continued on, I think in Saudi Arabia into the 90s. But as far as the actual legal abolition of it. So there you go. Let's move over to North and South America, and then we'll talk about India, which is probably maybe the most interesting. So North and South America. All right. So the first place that Columbus comes is the Caribbean islands. The Caribbean islands are so named because a group of people from, I think, Venezuela or somewhere in the northern coast of South America had conquered and enslaved the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean islands. And these people who had conquered and enslaved it were called the Caribs. And Columbus and his guys said that they were the Caribs had captured the natives and were fat. They ate them on a regular basis. They would eat them, and they would they said there would be boys in cages being fattened up for like a good meal and that sort of thing. For the longest time, people said like, "Oh, that's not true. That's just something they, made up to make the natives seem like bad people who needed to be civilized." Well, it turns out it's true, because now we have found the archaeological evidence of all these human bones that show the distinctive marks of having been, eaten. All the tool marks and tooth marks on bones, where they clearly, someone was using a knife and fork or something on this thing. Okay. Then of course we got the Aztec Empire in Mexico. The Aztecs had conquered the surrounding tribes, and they would make massive amounts of human sacrifice and rule and do whatever they wanted with the surrounding tribes. And in fact, Cortez and his soldiers, who wound up enslaving the natives themselves, still were assisted by the natives who wanted to throw off the Aztec oppression. And say what you want about Cortez and his slavery, it was bad, yes, regrettable, yes, but at least they didn't sacrifice people on massive levels. So like what the Aztecs would do is, like, your little village, they put up like a little stone pillar in it, and they come to your village and like, you better have somebody tied to that pillar, someone young and a good sacrifice. I mean, stacks and stacks of skulls. And we know this to be the case because we were fortunate that their writing system, and their historical documents the Aztecs kept were able to be translated. Okay. Then, of course, in the Inca Empire in South America, it's the same thing. The Incans had even planned to eat the Spanish and then use their horses for war. So, they were going to eat Pizarro and his men. That didn't happen. Pizarro and his men wound up, taking over. There's some sort of civilization that existed in the actual Amazon, and unfortunately we don't know much about it because they all died. The Pacific Northwest is interesting. Apparently there was a massive slave trade that went on and continued for a long time, of Native Americans enslaving other Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. When someone was enslaved, that meant that any marriage they had would be annulled right then. And then a slave could be sacrificed in a religious ceremony called a potlatch. And it was a proof of how rich you are. And then the lower classes in that region would regularly make their slaves become thieves for them. But the wealthier people wouldn't do that. So there's like a big emphasis on wealth. You can see that screaming out. And of course, there's this general statement we can make here that slavery was practiced across North America. Usually, stronger tribes attacked smaller tribes, and they didn't practice, in general, chattel slavery, which was practiced absolutely in North America, in the South, and that kind of thing later on. All right. Oh, and I guess I should add the primary reason that Africans were imported as slaves. We'll get into that. Part of it had to do. It was partially a racist thing, but the Europeans also had no qualms about enslaving Native Americans either. The difference was that Native Americans tended to die, especially from tropical diseases and diseases brought over by the white man, but the black man had great immune systems, and so those black slaves wouldn't die, and so that's one of the main reasons they became so valuable. All right. And of course, more of those slaves were sold in Africa to other Africans, which is more common. And you can see why it's really expensive to import a slave all the way to North America. Okay, so India is the interesting exception. Now, one of the issues is people like to bring up this Indian king of the Mauryan dynasty named Ashoka, and sometimes you'll find people, he's one of those guys that people just like claim stuff about Ashoka, and it's like they can just claim whatever they want. And so you'll probably, if you look up Ashoka, you'll find that he banned slavery or any good thing you could think of someone doing. Ashoka did it first, but then if you look it up, it's like there's actually no evidence for that. He ruled in basically in the 200s BC, and basically his story is like he was a fairly violent, oppressive ruler, but then there was this like massive war called the Kalinga War, which is a war of conquest that he engaged in. And apparently he didn't like how many people died, and he converted to Buddhism. And so he innovated, he was revolutionary because he innovated this concept they called the Dhamma, which is like conquest by Dhamma instead of by killing people. So like he wanted to teach you this like path of right living, the Dhamma, and you practice this, and then he would go around and spread that idea to the world, even to the Greeks. The Greek empires of Alexander's generals at that time, and so that's a pretty cool idea. Conquest of ideas instead of like killing people. But he didn't abolish slavery. He did ask for good treatments of slaves, and he did even encourage charity. But, of course, one of the main issues that we run into in India, which we're going to have to talk about, is they never developed really the concept of human equality. So the most interesting case in India is, of course, the Jains. So the Jains are an interesting Indian religion. Now, specifically, it's an atheistic religion that believes that there's like an essence behind everything, but it's explicitly not a personal being. It's just like an it. Okay, and the Jains, the core principle of Jainism as a religion is to never harm others ever. So, like, that's the core principle in Jainism. Just don't harm anyone ever for anything ever, ever, ever. So, I mean, it's like extreme. It's like they would originally went around naked with, like, I think something covering their mouths, so that they wouldn't swallow a fly by accident. And they believe it was wrong to eat meat. They believe it was wrong to eat vegetables, because vegetables were living things, and you couldn't harm living things ever, ever, ever. So, like, they would resort to eating scrap trash that someone else had thrown out. So that's how they live. They even have the issue of, like, as you become more advanced in it, you're supposed to not even have children. So that's always a problem for the growth of your religion. But it's clear, like, okay, well, the Jains, they thought slavery was wrong. And it's like, yes, they did. They thought that was wrong, to hurt anyone in any way, to force anything on anyone in any way. I mean, they wouldn't even hurt a fly. Okay, so the question is, well, wouldn't you say, because the Jains were around back in Ashoka's day. They were around probably 500, maybe 600 BC. They've been around for a long time. So didn't the Jains abolish slavery? Well, they did believe that slavery was wrong, but they did not believe that it should be abolished. And part of the reason, we may have a hard time grasping that is because we have to think in terms of the key doctrines of generally of all religions that come out of India. It's going to be this karma thing. And so karma is real simple. It's like, do something bad happens to you, do something good happens to you. Cause and effect. You know, karma yoga, right? Like you're going to go do your yoga poses and they're going to hurt and you're going to pay for some of that bad karma. So the idea is like, we've all done bad stuff and that's why we're here. Like this life is literally hell, in a sense. Like you're paying for bad things you've done. So like, and if you do bad things, you're gonna pay. So it means cause and effect. So the problem with India in general is it's a system of religion, you know, whatever it is, it's not gonna be focused on helping others in any way. Because like, hey, let's say that you're a slave. Okay? Well, why are you a slave? Well, you must deserve it because obviously something bad's happened to you and it must be you paying for your bad karma. So I'm not going to free you, you know, from your slavery because that would be wrong. Because, you know, that's your karma coming on you. So karma becomes a rationalization for a lot of selfish behavior, even racist behavior. You can say, well, that person that's born into that family, it must be because of sins, you know, they committed in some past life, you know, and that's why they're born into that poor family or that lower class family or whatever you perceive. And so you don't have this concept of like human equality at all. It's super racist system. It's just inherent in the nature because you inherently in karma is the view that life is fair, and life obviously isn't fair. You know, like people do bad stuff and get away with it. People do good stuff and don't get rewarded all the time. And so with karma, the way you explain that is you push it into the next life, and then there's justice in the next life, or maybe the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. You know, Christianity would admit the same thing, that like this life isn't fair, but there is a need for justice, and God will sort things out in the long run. So you can't really believe in justice while looking just at this life. You have to push things after death to ever believe in justice. And that's what India does, you know. As you die, you're literally experiencing your birth in your next life. And maybe you'll be a cockroach, maybe you'll be a donkey, who knows. But that's the problem in India. You have something that's so close, and yet they're not going to abolish slavery. Okay? So, now it gets interesting. Europe is perhaps, especially under the Roman Empire, and the Greek and then later Roman Empire, they apparently were the worst. Or shall we say the most successful at being evil. So like they really were good at enslaving people. But that is going to be a discussion for another time. I hope you enjoyed this video. What we're going to do is next time we're going to pick up right there and we're going to take a look at Europe specifically and the horrors of slavery in Europe. Hello, this is Ben. If you enjoyed this video but you still have more questions, then check out my blog at benjoiner.home.blog, or you can check out other videos on this channel which hopefully are organized well enough into playlists where you can see them. And of course, you should be able to find linked everywhere my email, social media, and you can contact me however you want. Have a great day.